to our headquarters and our offices all around the world to stimulate thought, creativity, innovative ideas, discussion, debate, and we're continuing that in the DC office with a series of Google DC Talks. Our headquarters in Mountain View has hosted scientists and chefs and musicians and authors and politicians, including both Senator McCain and President-elect Obama. So our illustrious crew here joins quite a history of speakers and thought, discussion, and debate that we've had in our offices. Today's DC Talk will be the first in a three-part series of town hall meetings on the tech agenda for the incoming Congress and the administration. Today's topic is building an infrastructure for a 21st century economy. We're going to focus on infrastructure needed to foster innovation and economic growth in two main areas, broadband and energy, and the architecture of the networks, in the case of the internet being an open architecture, and how that plays into the deployment and infrastructure needs of the network itself. This theme builds upon a talk that our CEO, Eric Schmidt, gave in DC on Tuesday on the intersection between technology and the economy. Later talks in December and January will focus on transparency in government, kind of government 2.0, as well as the internet's role in promoting freedom of expression around the world. I'm grateful to our panel for being here today, and I'll introduce them shortly. The style of how we're going to run this is I'm going to ask some questions. I encourage the panelists to ask questions of one another. As a town hall, I encourage you, the audience, to ask questions. There's mics on both sides here. You could line up, identify yourself, and ask your question. We're also trying something new today. We've asked people to submit questions and vote on them through Google Moderator. This is a new tool. It's an application that lets audiences in discussions like these submit questions on the spot through a link, which is right there on the bottom. You can't see that. Move closer. And then you can vote on the questions, and as we go through the discussion, we'll take a look at the questions that rise to the top in terms of the voting and ask some of those questions today as well. I'd also like to mention that this talk is being taped on YouTube and will be put on YouTube. So with that, let me introduce our panelists. First, we have Gigi Sohn, president and co-founder of Public Knowledge. It's a nonprofit organization that addresses the public stake in the convergence of communications policy and intellectual property law. As chief strategist for Public Knowledge, Gigi frequently is quoted in the press, has appeared on numerous TV and radio programs, and has testified before Congress. Next is Jennifer Canty, founder and CEO of Dyscern. It's an e-commerce company and leading retailer of refurbished consumer electronics equipment in the DC metro area. In 6 years, she has built Dyscern from a home-based business to a multi-million-dollar company with 20 employees. Her company's been recognized by Inc. magazine as one of the fastest-growing privately held companies in the U.S. She's got her MBA from the University of Maryland and her BA from Michigan State. Next to her is Ben Scott, Policy Director at Free Press. He oversees all government and legislative affairs for the largest public interest organization in the U.S., working exclusively on communications policy. He's testified before the Senate and the House and was a former legislative aide for then Representative Bernie Sanders. Next we have Stephen Ezell. He's a senior analyst with Information Technology and Innovation Foundation. Focuses on international IT competitiveness and national innovation policies. He was previously with Peer Insight, an innovation research and consulting firm that he co-founded in 2003. Beside him is Harry Wingo. He recently joined Google as policy counsel, directing their work on energy policy. He was previously executive vice president of the current group, where he advocated for increasing the efficiency, reliability, and security of the nation's electric grid. He's a graduate of Yale Law School and the Naval Academy, and served for 6 years as a Navy SEAL. And lastly, we have Michael Oldak. He's Senior Director of State Competitive and Regulatory Policies at the Edison Electric Institute, an association of shareholder-owned electric companies representing 70% of the U.S. electric power industry. So with that, let's get started. The American economy is facing serious challenges currently. We're losing our competitive edge in science and technology, and our status as a world leader in innovation and small business entrepreneurship. At At the same time, the internet is transforming the daily lives of people around the globe. Yet its promise remains unfulfilled for millions of Americans who lack robust, high-speed internet connections. Meanwhile, our nation's century-old electric power infrastructure is overtaxed and inefficient. So imagine you're a transition advisor to the Obama administration. What is your assessment of the current status of broadband deployment in the U.S.? Or in the case of the electric grid, what is the current status of our electric grid in the U.S.?
I'll start. I think it's poor. I'll start with, I don't know so much about the electric grid. I'll leave that to Harry. But certainly, we don't have broadband policy in this country. And because we don't have broadband policy in this country, we don't actually really know, we don't actually have a full grasp of what our broadband infrastructure looks like, where it's deployed, who's adopted. And we have a sense, people have done studies. Every international study that's been done shows us, somewhere between 15th and 20th in broadband adoption. So I think the first problem we have is we need information. We need to know what infrastructure is out there, what resources do we have out there, and then we can make a determination of what to do about it. I think I can say with some confidence that we don't have a great deal of competition in broadband access, particularly for residential customers, and that needs to be fixed. But I think there's a basic informational question that needs to be resolved before we even think about how we solve the problem of not having broadband policy in this country.
All right, I'll go next. I agree with what Gigi is saying. I think that if you're looking at this from 10,000 feet and the first 5 things on your mind all start with economic growth or investment, you have to think about what are the key problems of broadband infrastructure. And you can look around town and find 100 reports on glossy paper that tell you that broadband is a great idea, that it enhances economic growth, it enhances social opportunity, it's an educational tool. Broadband is the lifeblood of our economy. But all these reports end with the conclusion of broadband, yay. What do we do then? Okay, how do we get broadband to more people? How do we make sure people subscribe to it? And so I think we need to focus on 2 key problems. Problem number 1 is availability. This is a problem that most often comes to mind that people deal with on Capitol Hill. This is in rural America, roughly 5 to 10% of rural households do not have a wireline broadband connection to their home. This is the availability problem. But much less focused on, but probably definitely much more important in the long term, is the value question. Why aren't people buying broadband if it's available to them? Why are broadband penetration rates in the high 50 percentages, and cable television and cell phones are up in the 80 and 90% ranges? Those cable TV and cell phones are great, but they don't give you all these economic benefits that you find in the broadband yay papers. So how do we get broadband up from 55 to 85? That's a value question. It's a function of what people believe that product gives them. To me, it's a question of speed and price. And if the price per unit of speed is low enough, more and more cool stuff goes on the internet and attracts eyeballs, interest, and ultimately subscribership. That's the key problem that we need to be addressing with broadband policy straight out of the gates.
So real quick on the grid, I want to jump in. Connection is Department of Energy just recently got a really good backgrounder on what smart grid means. They said you can think of it as the extension of the internet into the electricity system. And electricity and power is so fundamental to everything that we do, our lives. And going back to what Ben said about availability and value, there's a lesson in history. If you consider the 1930s, electricity, some folks it was kind of a new technology, it had been around for a while, but 90% of people in cities had access, had availability for electricity. Only 10% of the folks in rural areas had it. And to fix that problem, so there was a huge, as you know, economic challenge going on at the time. And what happened was FDR said, well, let's do rural electrification. And we knew it was going to be a big project to roll out electricity to 90% of Americans. And this was a case where the private sector had its role, but this also required vision, leadership, and the government jumping in there and doing something. So first there was executive action, which happened very quickly. FDR led on this and said, It's not acceptable. We want all Americans to have this. And what happened is he removed. In 1935, he started the Rural Electrification Administration. And then a year later, Congress came on. I think initial appropriations were like $400 million. It'd be interesting to run the CPI on it and see what that is in today's dollars. But the big point of this is availability and the value of it. Somebody had the vision to realize we want all Americans to have access to this. And at the time it was electricity, but now there are complete overlaps between our quality of life and the impact that both the power system and the internet has. And we're looking at Mike here today because he's just been talking about this. He's on the cutting edge in the industry. The Edison Electric Institute is really taking the focus on smart grid and for what it can mean for all of us.
Johanna, your question began by posing the challenges that the United States faces in international competitiveness, and those are very serious. One of the first challenges that the U.S. has is that it does not have a national innovation policy. The United States is alone amongst industrialized countries without having a national policy to foster its, at a national level, its innovation competitiveness. So as an advisor to the Obama administration, creating a national innovation policy that focuses on a number of issues, including R&D tax credits, the immigration of high-skilled foreign citizens to the United States, reforming patent law, reforming trade activities to make trade law focus not always on opening new markets, but also enforcing the rights of U.S. companies. And so the U.S. across a broad spectrum needs a national innovation policy, and one key area of that would be creating a explicitly stated national broadband strategy. Whereas the center-right approach has been to leave it to markets to come up with the appropriate level of broadband availability for the marketplace. I think an Obama administration would be much more proactive about making sure that availability of broadband to all American citizens is increased. I think an Obama administration would feel accountable for making that happen, whereas the center-right administration might support that, but feel like that the market will ultimately get us where we need to be.
I think we're going to be relying on the electric grid more into the future than we ever have in the past. And I sort of, I've heard these comments that the electric grid is in trouble, but frankly, it's not. If you've ever visited some of the high-tech facilities that we have, we are 20th century technology. But I think we can make it better. And I look at the smart grid and what we're doing now as really bringing the vision and the capabilities and the opportunities that we've seen from the internet. I was here before the internet. I was in engineering school listening to President Kennedy and our Apollo mission. And to a certain extent, I think that's what we're looking at right now. We need that same kind of drive to get more kids into engineering, to get more kids into science, to get back into this. Yes, the grid can get better, but we are looking at that. It's always been a cost and benefit analysis, and I think the opportunities and the support that the grid can do for improving the competitiveness of the United States and moving us forward, I think, are enormous. And I think that's sort of the visions that we all share going forward, that this is a transformational technology, that we are in an era of transformation with climate change, with the economy, with moving from pre-internet to internet. And I look at the changes for the electric industry similar to the change that the internet has brought to all of our lives, that once we apply this technology to the electric grid and give customers the information and the tools to respond, that we're going to be able to meet our energy challenges much better in the future.
Look, picking up on a thing that all of you sort of raised, which is the raw reports versus the value proposition, and we have reports on the grid, now we're starting to see report after report on the grid as well. Are consumers really ready for this, especially if it costs them a little bit more for their electricity? And so, can the model of the internet be instructed here, and how can it be?
Let me answer that, because I've been on these debates where everyone says, well, you're going to charge everybody another $5 on their bill for these smart meters and all this stuff. And let me tell you, they're looking in the rearview mirror. We are a $750 billion industry. We're about to add another $1.5 trillion just to keep the lights on. We've got an aging grid, aging industry. We need to make that investment over the next 20 years. On top of that, we're going to add maybe another $1 trillion or more for climate change. And we're looking at these new technologies, clean coal technologies with carbon capture and storage. We're looking at advanced nuclear, but they're not going to be here for another 5, 10, 15 years. So what do we do in the interim? And we're looking at heavily, we have a whole group within EEI that's doing nothing but energy efficiency, dynamic pricing, all of these things. You cannot look at this as adding $5 to today's bill. You've got to look at the industry going forward. What will it look like with the smart grid or without the smart grid? Because what we're seeing is we've got these pilots all over the country. And I don't care which pilot you look at, the answer is the same. When we start telling customers that what the price of electricity is, they will reduce peak on demand 15%. When we give them the enabling technologies that we're looking at, programmable thermostats, smart appliances, we're seeing reductions of 30%. And what that means is, and let me tell you, before we make these investments, huge investments, we have to go through a state commission of regulators and consumer advocates and make the case. And all the pilots have shown that going forward, customers save money and they like it. We're seeing 80-90% of the customers want to keep their meters. They've been through the pilot and they're happy. And these are the things that are confusing. When I moved here 20 years ago with my house, I got an electric rate that was $0.015, $2.50, and on peak during the summer, it was 18 cents a kilowatt hour from noon to 6 p.m. every day during the summer week. And I know if you looked at that 18 cents, you're probably all paying about 10 or 11. You'd say, no, I don't want that. Well, let me tell you, I save 10% on my electric bill every year with that rate. And when we start talking about critical peak pricing, send those proper pricing signals through, when they occur to us, we start seeing less costs, and those are costs that we don't pass through to customers. So I think this is, we've got to give this a chance. And really, when someone says, don't do it, it costs too much, ask them, where's their data? Because the independent pilots that I've seen all show positive for consumers.
Just real quick on the energy grid point, I agree with Mike, but also we can't afford not to. And we're getting the message out to everyone. And in fact, there's a lot of interest on energy security, to make the investments now at this point in clean renewable energy, solar, wind on an industrial scale, geothermal, advanced geothermal is another one. That's where I call it the other drilling. It's where you go down deep and you manufacture a geothermal field. We could have huge amounts of electricity can be provided from that. Then you also have climate change. It's a matter of global concern. And so if you look at into the future, you take the long view. Google just recently we put out a blog, Google 2030, with our vision for where we need to go as a nation, our proposal for what it will take, both the amounts or estimates of how much it will cost, and also the payoff, the return. We found about over $1 trillion of value of making this move to clean renewable energy, having a smart grid so that consumers know every day exactly how much power they're using. You can take action accordingly. Also, plug-in electric vehicles, the electrification of our transportation system. That's another aspect of creating jobs, also energy security. And if you think of electricity as a fuel, and what that will take, all the logistics that are involved, and making sure we have new power sources that are clean to power those electric vehicles that are coming, it also means more green jobs. So, square points, Mike.
What about on the broadband side? I mean, one could argue that the vision of the internet is real for people on the broadband side, and yet we have universal service programs and other programs that are largely focused on the traditional voice network. And how do we shift that over, recognizing that we have a legacy of consumers and users who depend very much on the traditional voice network?
Well, I think one of the issues here is that the marketplace will underinvest in the societally optimal amount of broadband left to their own devices. So because broadband brings positive externalities to the society, there is an appropriate role for government to play in fostering increasing the availability of broadband networks. There are a number of two particular externalities to talk about are competitiveness externalities and regional externalities. So studies have found that cities or communities that have broadband access actually have a 1% higher rate of economic growth than cities or communities that do not. So for rural communities that don't have access to broadband, they're automatically put at an economic growth disadvantage. Competitive externalities are also real. Studies have found that for countries that have the most sophisticated technology buyers, that will lead to the creation of an information technology industry that is more competitive than in other countries. So there's real strong externalities. And with regard to your question about the USF, one thing that another study found was that 25% of U.S. children living at home under the age of 18 don't have access to an internet connected computer. For children living in households that earn less than $30,000 a year, 50% of them don't have access to a computer. So here we have children who are starting in life and are automatically at a disadvantage because they don't have access to the educational opportunities that they can get online. They won't have opportunity to learn new skills of interacting with computers, of developing programming. So it's a real strong incentive to transform the Universal Service Fund from a focus on only voice communication to one that also thinks about broadband. So right now, the Universal Service Fund for low-income families subsidizes the cost of voice communication, $10 a month on their phone bill through the Lifeline program. The Link Up program subsidizes half the cost of a telephone, actually having a telephone in the home. So if we reformed the Universal Service Fund to focus on moving from voice communication to broadband communication, we would be able to allow low-income citizens to get connected to the broadband instead of having just a home telephone, use a voice over internet protocol, so they can have a far more sophisticated way of communicating with others on a global basis, be far less expensive for them to have international calling plans. And the next step, I think, in broadband policy for low-income citizens in the United States is to move the Universal Service Fund from voice-only to broadband communications.
I think what Steve is describing is structural change. It's the big obstacles that we face. We need structural change. So I want you all to brace yourselves. I'm about to use some words that have been profane in this town for about the last 10 years. We're going to need to make industrial policy, and it's going to require regulation. It's just the way it is. Otherwise, we'd be throwing hundreds of billions of dollars at a problem without any oversight or rules of the road, and we all know that would be crazy. So we need to really look at these questions from the point of view of what is the social and economic outcome that we want to produce. If we really believe, and I think at least those of us in this room are likely to agree with this, that universal broadband access and most importantly, universal broadband adoption are economic and social goals of the highest order for this country, then we're going to have to take really aggressive measures to get there. And I want to emphasize another point that Steve made, which is what is the consequences of not being connected to the 21st century network? There was a really interesting paper that was put out a couple of years ago by some scholars, one at Carnegie Mellon and another out at USC, and they looked at the reverse of network effects theory. Network effects theory says that the more people you get connected to your network, the more valuable the network becomes, and the more valuable it is for those who are connected to the network. So they flipped that around and they said, well, what's the impact then of those who are not connected? Because if you plot the curve, there's going to be an ever smaller number of people who are not connected. So what happens to them when they're not connected? And what they found is that network effects flips over. And that the longer you remain in a community that is not connected, the more damage you suffer in social and economic costs. So if we believe that our structural policy, our industrial policy, and the rules of the road to get us there ought to begin with those who need it most, incremental change through market self-regulation is not going to get us there. It's not going to address those problems. So we're going to have to really adjust our thinking and flip our equations around in order to begin from the right starting point and to start asking the right questions.
I want to give Jennifer an opportunity to speak if you want to.
Actually, and Jennifer, I'd like for you to comment on maybe what the consequences would be for you and bring us to a real world situation if you weren't connected to a high speed.
Well, I wasn't connected to a high speed connection. Basically, my company wouldn't exist. I mean, I'm completely 100% online. I don't have a brick and mortar shop. I sell everything worldwide over the internet. I started primarily on eBay, and then I've moved to multi-channel. I sell on all your major marketplaces as well as my own website. So for me, my company wouldn't exist. So that just to start off. And so for me, I think yes, obviously the more people that have access to broadband, I see all the value of what you're speaking about. But for me personally, it's not only about the access, it's about the openness of the access as well. I think having been part of the network, I am now concerned about more of the next step beyond that, keeping everything open, as well as the issues. The internet is such an ecosystem now that impacts now with eBay. The creation of eBay has created this whole microcosm of sellers like myself and those that are still on the pops out of their basement, which is what I started as. And we have all kinds of issues that really impact us and impact the larger retailers and online presence. And their issues, while our issues are the same, our resources are limited. So what I find is the larger people are able to move the policy in a direction that will help them. And so that's where we get to the open access piece of it, with the net neutrality issue, and as well as sales tax. That's another issue for us, and also for and that impacts those that are rural, for example. If they don't have a store, so they can't buy their iPod or whatever else at the local Best Buy because there isn't one where they go online. If they were then imposed shipping and sales tax, they may not, they cause more economic hurt. They're not going to be able to do that. So there's issues along those lines that I'm facing every day, given the nature of how my business exists. But I definitely think that from the access, the broadband access piece is key. I think as we innovate online, we are always looking at it from a broadband standpoint. So we don't really think about those that are still using dial-up, though I know that those people do still exist. So it definitely has that. But I really think the key piece is, as maybe speaking to the regulation side of it, is making sure that everything is open as well. It's not just about access, it's about having access to everything. And I think that's one of the key features.
I just want to say briefly, I think the attitude adjustment is not just about regulation, good regulation, bad. Clearly, the last 8 years has demonstrated that if you let the free market run amok, it's not going to lead to good things. But I think there's an attitude adjustment to the extent that if we had the kind of adoption of water or electricity or gas, heat, that we had for broadband, it would be a national scandal. Okay? There needs to be an attitude adjustment that broadband is critical to full participation in our society and in social welfare, social and economic welfare. And it provides access to education, to good health care, to commerce. And like water, like electricity, it's a necessity and not a luxury. And I do think it's often portrayed as, oh, it's fun, it's video games, and it's YouTube. No, not to diss my hosts, but that it's more like a lifeline. It's more like a necessity, like telephone service. So I think that kind of attitude adjustment, and I think the president-elect has that sense. His technology plan clearly doesn't just talk about some of the policy wonky things we talk about here, but it talks about the relation of broadband to all the other social and economic concerns we have in this society, to energy, the environment, healthcare, education, and so on and so forth. And I think, so there needs to be, I think, a much bigger shift in attitude.
Let's pick up on this point a little bit. Obviously, President-elect Obama has stated his belief that the key reason for the success of the internet is that it is because it's the most open network in history. That's what he's stated. So how do you anticipate that this fundamental belief of the President-elect how will it be applied in the policies of the administration and in Congress in terms of the openness of the internet?
Well, I'll tackle that one. I think it's pretty straightforward. I think if you listen to what the President-elect said, he said, I'll take a backseat to no one when it comes to network neutrality. What he meant by that was this fundamental characteristic of the internet as an open without gatekeepers, without control, with perfect consumer choice. It's what we ought to try to continue to have to generate more of the same kind of innovation, growth, investment, etc. On the internet. So I would anticipate you're going to see a heavy emphasis on resolving this question of openness quickly. I think openness requires very simple, straightforward oversight, a simple set of rules of the road that everybody in the industry knows how it's going to work, how it's going to affect their businesses, whether they're a network provider or a content company or a service provider or a consumer. Everyone's expectations will be clear when openness rules are established. I would expect to see leadership on that front from the White House.
I think it's probably very personal to the president-elect. Look at how he ran his campaign. You know, imagine if there were gatekeepers in the middle of the internet determining what he could or could not do, or what websites, what speed his websites would load at, or what kind of text messaging he could do with his supporters. I mean, this is a guy who was elected who came from nothing. Okay, to be Hillary Clinton and then to be John McCain, and a lot of it is due to the technology and the fact that we get to control the technology and he got to control his message, as opposed to what we've been used to for the last 70 years, some gatekeeper, a broadcaster, a cablecaster, a satellite provider controlling what we get to see or hear or say.
Let's go ahead.
A couple of comments on this issue. First, to address something Ben said about the need for, I quote, industrial policy towards innovation or broadband in this country. I think we have to be very careful here in how we use our terms, use our language. Industrial policy, I think, can be rightfully construed to mean different things to different people. If you think of what France did in the 1980s with creating a company called Bull to go up against IBM and compete in software, well, that's an example of a different level of industrial policy. I don't think we're talking about here favoring a Verizon or a Comcast or any particular company. So I would frame it as we're not looking at an industrial policy, but we're looking at a national strategy towards broadband deployment that still recognizes that it will be the markets that will be the fundamental drivers of bringing broadband access to American citizens, and through the role of competition in the marketplace, driving down the cost of access while increasing the speed in which people will be able to get online. With regard to the net neutrality issue, the internet is, as Obama said, one of the most open platforms in history. Again, though, there's language that gets caught up here. In the net neutrality conversation, there are some important aspects to it. Do the network operators, do the broadband companies have the right to block or degrade content that moves over their wires? Clearly, that's unacceptable. ITIF, no group here, I think, would agree that a company has the right to block another organization's ability to use their pipes to transmit certain types of information or to make certain political messages. But a more fundamental question in the net neutrality debate becomes, do broadband providers have any right to either proactively manage the operation of their networks, and do they have the right to provide tiered levels of services to companies? Well, on the second question, I think it's accepted that broadband providers do have a right to offer tiered level of services to consumers. So we are accustomed to paying certain or different price levels to Verizon or Comcast if we want certain download speeds or upload speeds. That's accepted. Then the question becomes, do the broadband operators have a right to charge application providers like a Google, like an Apple, like an eBay, variable tiers of service? And I think the Information Technology and Innovation Foundation would say, yes, that is a legitimate way for companies to operate to recoup a portion of the very expensive investments it takes to bring broadband across the United States. So I think when we begin to think about net neutrality, let's think about these three different issues, because nobody is arguing for a closed network or one that companies can't control, but there are gradations in how they're allowed to operate and manage their systems.
Then our Jennifer.
For those that are not Apple, Google, eBay, like Dyscern, for example, doesn't have the budget to pay for that sort of access, and we would be limited. Right now, I'm competing against every major electronics retailer out there. If you're searching for a BlackBerry or Treo, and you're interested in refurbished, will likely come up. But does that mean what you're suggesting is me, Palm could block me, whoever, singular could decide, you know what, I'm going to block this, I'm going to pay for this, so my access, I'm pushed down. And so I think that's the concern for many small businesses, the medium-sized businesses, that, I don't have the resources to do that because I'm basically trying to keep my 20 employees employed with health insurance and the other benefits that I provide to them. So if I have to then take money to do that to pay for that sort of access, that would impede my business and perhaps even shut it down. So that's where the issue of net neutrality impacts those of us at this level is that we wouldn't have that ability to pay for that. So it does create, and we're creating jobs. My customer service representatives actually work in Michigan from their homes, and we've given them broadband access so they can work at home. Because if any of you are familiar with Michigan, there's quite a large unemployment level there, and so I'm giving back to the community where I was raised. So, there's so many things. So there are issues, and I'm not a policy wonk, obviously, but I can tell you from the reality of what would happen if the tiered level payment procedure went forward, there would be not only Dyscern, but numerous small retailers, small businesses that would go under because of that, because we have been created because of the openness and because we have the access and because we have the ability to promote ourselves freely without having to worry about, is somebody else outpacing me because they have a budget or to do that. So that's.
Let's compare the broadband and the electric grid in terms of whether or not there are similar choke points if you look at them from a network perspective, a network architecture perspective. For example, you could observe that with the internet, through a series of private and public peering arrangements, the backbone has largely been interconnected and open, and the last mile has proven to be the challenge from an infrastructure standpoint. There are some notable exceptions, but those tend to get resolved quickly. Is that similar in the electricity space, and what kind of problems do you see there in terms of choke points, and what lessons can we apply across the two networks?
I'll try and answer that. I think the similarity is that we have, since the beginning of the industry, built large baseload generating facilities. I mean, in the 50s and the 60s, the more you used it, the cheaper it was to buy because we wanted to incentivize larger, newer generators because the newer ones were cheaper to operate and were more efficient. And that sort of changed in the late 60s and 70s. I think going forward, and one of the promises that we look at from the internet, the smart grid, is applying that, we're going to be relying more on renewable technologies, more on distributed resources, more on storage capabilities, more on these distributed resources to bring into the grid, plug-in hybrid electric vehicles, all of these. And the electric grid is probably the largest moving machine in the world. I mean, we've got moving parts all over, they're all interconnected. We're trying to get them to operate together. And we do a pretty good job of that. Every once in a while, as you know, we have a problem, we try to fix it. But being able to integrate all these things to actually run our systems more efficiently, as well as integrating all these new technologies into the grid moving forward, I think this is one of the challenges, I think one of the visions that we all have as the benefit. So it's sort of like a choke point. How do you bring on resources, wind or solar, that are variable? You know, the sun doesn't shine at night, so we don't rely on solar, but we can use batteries to back it up. Same thing with wind. You get more wind at night, not during the day. On the hottest day of the year, the wind's probably not blowing. So we have to bring all these resources together. I think the smart grid and these technologies are going to be a way of getting over those technologies, those hurdles, and integrating everything more efficiently. And let me not forget energy efficiency and demand response. I think that's really probably one of the most important things, bringing customers into the equation. So that on the hottest day of the year, when we send them a price signal, and for those of you out there who've got a programmable thermostat and can help us today, please let us change your thermostat. And they do. And this is where we're bringing in, I look at every thermostat as a resource now that we can integrate in. And Before we didn't have any access to people's thermostats. We don't have smart refrigerators or smart toasters or smart dryers, electric dryers, which are major loads. To the extent that we can have a chip in there, and we've seen that technology, and we can bring them on and say, look, we're in a troubled period. We need to turn your dryer off for a little bit. Fine. And people will save money at the end on their bills.
Just a real quick thought on that analogy. For the electric grid, think of consumer access and choice as well. As Mike said, if you've got these clean, new renewable options that are out there for solar or wind, let's say you want that. If you're finding the public's getting more engaged, that they actually really want to do the right thing on, but also cost matters as well. And as you have the change going to, say if we have cap and trade, if you put a price on carbon, which is something Google supports, if you put a price on carbon, that means that you're going to really see the market get engaged on what solar, how it compares to, say, the option of coal or geothermal or to nuclear. And if you have that information across a smart grid in real time, you as a consumer, somewhere to the internet, you have a choice of where you want to go for that option. And to do that, as Mike said, it's a very complex system already. You have different regulatory schemes. The states have their role, the IOUs and the public power at the local level. Then you have the ISOs and the RTOs that are moving things across interregional and state lines. And so to overlay that with broadband, with the infrastructure, the communications infrastructure, that's going to allow consumers to know what the value is, but also have a choice. In addition to selecting your power, what if you actually put up solar panels on your roof? Or you have these new plug-in electric vehicles, and at certain points, you might want to sell power to your neighbor or sell power back into the grid. And if you don't have broadband, if you don't have the communications access and choice, and if it's not an open system that allows you to make those choices and to get that value, the smart grid will not develop as quickly as it would otherwise.
Let's take some questions from the audience if you want to line up with the mics. And while folks are doing that, let me ask for more specifics. What do you see as the near-term and long-term hurdles to achieving nationwide, high-speed, robust, affordable broadband or a smart grid? And specifically, what are the most daunting of those hurdles? Is it technological? Is it legal and regulatory at the state level, at the federal level? Is it political? Let's talk about some of the obstacles.
Let me start off with that. I think that I could rattle off a laundry list of policy changes that I think would head us in the right direction, but I'll not do that because I think that the key point, the first step is we need to start changing our assumptions and our expectations and the politics of how we deal with these issues. And I want to push back on this notion that the term industrial policy is unusable. The pejorative shadow of state socialism that hung over that term is gone. Those days are over. We need to reclaim these terms because they don't mean those things, except in a political environment that branded them as bad. So when I say industrial policy, what I mean is we've got to get out of the business of cartel management that the government has too long practiced. If you're looking at energy and telecommunications, what you typically see is one segment of the industry comes to Washington and they say, we want this piece, and the other one says, well, I want this piece, and the other one says, I want that piece, and I want you to make these changes because these changes mean real money for us next quarter. And so what the regulator says is, all right, you get yours this time and you don't, but next time around I'm going to give you yours and you yours, and they do this little dance where they throw bones around the different segments of the industry. It happens all over the place. No one is thinking about, well, no, that model is over. We need to think about you all at the same time. We need to think about how the cable industry is going to interconnect with the broadband infrastructure that we're building. We need to think about how wireless is going to play in rural areas and help transition universal service line. We need to think about how all that overlays on the smart grid technology so that consumers can be empowered to make new kinds of choices. And we need to have rules of the road that stretch across all of these different industries so that we're no longer dealing in piecemeal. And if we can change the way we think about how government works, we alter the politics and therefore the outcomes in each of these industrial segments. And I think that has to be our initial goal. And I think this is a moment when that can actually happen. And we have an opportunity to begin looking at ideas that have long been off the table.
I would agree with that. I think the problem is political/institutional. And we can start with responsibility for a lot of these questions. We're talking about the Federal Communications Commission. I mean, this is, I was thinking about this walking over this morning. I was at the Ford Foundation about 10 years ago. And one of the first things I did was I went to the bowels of the archives and so started doing some research about the Ford Foundation's history in funding media policy organizations like mine and Ben's. And one of the first things I came across was a memo, 1978 memo from a guy named Henry Geller, who was a former FCC counsel and also head of the National Telecommunications Information Administration, and talked about the structural deficiencies of the FCC, how opaque it was, how beholden to industry capture it was, the problems with the revolving door of staff going into industry and coming back again. And that's 30 years later, it's probably worse than it ever was. So, I mean, to the extent that the President-elect's been talking about making industry more, agencies more transparent, allowing for more citizen participation, and actually agency people actually considering what the public has to say and using it in their decision making, the FCC to me would be a great petri dish, a great lab to start that examination because it needs some serious reform.
Take a question? Yeah. Can you hear me? I'm Celia Wexler. I'm with the Union of Concerned Scientists, and I deal with a lot of scientists at federal agencies. And my impression overall, and this is kind of a good segue from what Gigi was talking about, is that really at the agency level, there is a lack of understanding of how to get information on the internet that's actually user-friendly. And they're also using consultants that are charging them way too much to do relatively simple things. And I wondered if you were going to give advice to the Obama administration so that they could get agencies to understand what their mission is and how they get that information out. What advice would you give? And do you have a suggestion for who should be the chief technology officer?
I think having the chief technology officer at all is a huge start. I mean, my understanding is the role of that person is supposed to ensure that the agencies actually make data available to the public, that they allow for public participation, and that they allow agencies to talk to each other. Okay, but to the extent that you're concerned about having government information available, if I can harken back to the FCC, that website is a disgrace. I let my interns get the information because I can't do it myself. For the agency that's supposed to be in charge of communications, it's really disgraceful. So I think the notion that you can have a cabinet level person whose main duty is to ensure that government is more transparent, that's a great place to start.
I think we can also learn from the campaign. This was the most successful campaign in history using technology to engage people, to interact, to allow people to feed their ideas into the campaign, to meet one another, to talk about things in conjunction with campaign staff. And I think that model of using these kinds of tools, web interfaces, text messaging, but also using technology to get people in bricks and mortar rooms and face-to-face, that's really effective and I think really eye-opening for a lot of people as they participated in this political process. I think a lot of those lessons can be transferred over to government.
I'm excited about how Obama envisions applying information technology to transform our conception of governance. He said that before he passes any major legislation, he would put it online for 5 days for a period of review and comment by the American public. He said he would make all national defense, agency or meetings of congressional panels available to the public and be streamed live over the internet. And it's a fantastic way to connect the American people to the operations of government that I think really portends a change in how we engage in our society. I won't venture a specific answer of who should be the next CTO. I think, as Gigi says, it would be phenomenal if our nation were to have one. One comment I know Eric Schmidt has been bandied about as possible CTO. I don't know if you want to come over from Google. But I do think that it would be important that the CIO have experience with how the government and agency operations work. So I think to just get a CIO who has only had experience in the private sector, while he would certainly be able to bring a lot of good best practices from the private sector, you need somebody who has an understanding of how government agencies operate, and I think that should be a criteria for the CIO. One other comment, the World Bank, a couple of years back, completely transformed its understanding of what its mission was into a knowledge management organization, and that put in place a system, essentially an internet for the World Bank, that would enable it to come up with the answer to any question about global economic development in 24 hours by connecting everybody at the World Bank into its knowledge management network. If you had a question, you can contact the person in Botswana about how to get rural roads created there. But it was a complete rethinking about what the mission of their agency was, and I think, in answer to your question, and Gigi's comments, we need to have a similar rethink in many of our agencies about what their goal towards furthering the public good is.
Speaking of change, unofficial reports are that we may have a new leadership of the U.S. Energy Committee. Go ahead.
Hi, my name is Whit Whitterman with the State Department. One of the policy overlaps between the two industries is whether, to what extent the transmission function and the production function should be separated out. I know on the energy side we've had some experience. I think you probably jumped earlier and could talk about whether that's been a success. And then on the information side, we get questions from different countries around the world on functional separation and whether we have, for instance, should have multiple pipes coming into the house or a single pipe with multiple providers over that one pipe. Can we afford to construct a network with multiple people laying fiber to each house, or is there a more efficient way? So I'd be interested here.
Let me say, we've had experiments we have vertically integrated utilities that do the generation, transmission, distribution. We have, in some of my companies, they are wires only, and they have generation arms. There are all these experiments going forward. I think the important thing is not necessarily how it's done, whether one is better than the other. The fact is that moving forward, we need the smart grid and the internet to give us the ability to make sure and understand exactly what's going on our transmission grid instantaneously in real time to operate that system the most efficient way we can. I think this is what we're looking forward to going forward, where we can now, where someone was saying, putting these devices on transmission lines were $100,000 a piece, now it's $5,000. So you can put a device on a transmission line and know that that line, exactly the voltage, the amperage, the current, the ambient temperature, these transmission lines that are running through valleys or in the open, they are limited by the thermal capacity. They heat up. And to the extent that you've got a wind blowing over that line, you can put more electricity through it. And we need to know this, and that's where we're going. And let's look at the problem. The problem is running the grid as efficiently as we can. I think one of the visions that we have is that with the smart grid, we'll understand in real time exactly what's going on in the wind sector, the energy efficiency, demand response. We'll be able to integrate all these different moving pieces, including customer energy efficiency at the same time, and that'll lower the full cost and make our system more reliable and more efficient.
I saw a recent study that said the application of IT to the energy network could reduce global carbon emissions from energy production by 50% by the year 2020. Is that what your research shows as well?
I'm not sure I would go that far. I think that, number one, when we operate our systems more efficiently, as hopefully, then you will be generating less electricity. When we are able to bring customers on and send the right price signals and reduce demand when we are running those units that may be dirtier than others, will reduce CO2. I mean, there are lots of promises that we have, coming from the smart grid.
Quick thought on that. There are numbers out there we're still figuring out. For example, there's an older study by Every that mentions it could go up to as high as 25% if you had a 21st century grid. There are other studies that are coming out. One important thing is that there is the energy side, getting rid of the choke points, having more transmission lines, more access to clean energy options. But there's also the use of broadband. Jennifer, your company, for example, if you looked at the carbon footprint of what it would be otherwise if you were bricks and mortar, it could be a big number. There are other options that broadband is going to make available. One my favorite things that's developing. Think about what they're doing in Japan and Austria with mobile wallets. The ability to just take your cell phone and you pay for things. You consider how much coins and cash are moved around, and just, with trucks, it's probably be a big number. But just, the ability to be efficient as well. And government, getting rid of paper, dematerialization of moving bits around instead of some of the material goods is going to become increasingly important as we look at what we can do for CO2 reduction.
I used to say this issue of how much the smart grid. There's a more recent study by EPRI that really was trying to look more just at the smart grid, and it's probably closer to 5 or 8%. But I think what we're talking about is as we smarten the grid and bring on these other technologies, we can reach some. Hopefully, this is the vision.
Since Harry touched on the international some things going on internationally, let's take the top question on the Google moderator, which is when it comes to broadband speeds and penetration, the U.S. is far behind many other developed nations. Why is this, and what can we do to reverse the trend? What can we learn from lessons from what's happening in other places, both with respect to broadband availability and penetration rates, as well as electricity?
I don't mind starting it. We've been working on this for a while, so I'm sure you have some things to say as well. I think this actually goes nicely with the question on different models for competitive markets in broadband access. So there's sort of an interesting story here, which says, in 1996, the U.S. passed a big telecom bill. The notion was, let's take our infrastructure, and instead of having a monopoly service provider, let's put multiple competitors on the same infrastructure. Then, through the USTR and a major push from the Clinton administration, we went around the world and we said to Western Europe and to the developed economies in Asia, you should adopt this model so that U.S. companies can go into your markets and compete against your incumbent telephone providers by getting on your networks and becoming competitors. So lots of those countries adopted that model. Meanwhile, back at the ranch, we abandoned that model. So now, if you look at all the countries that are doing really well in broadband penetration, doing really well in speeds, doing really well in pricing, many of them have that model of multiple competitors sharing the same infrastructure, whether it's functional separation or a more traditional structural separation regime. The regulatory model matters a lot, and I think that at the very least we need to study that very closely and see about lessons that can be learned for our own broadband policy, because it is unsustainable for us to watch as Europe and Asia sells 10, 20, 50 times the speed for the same money. It's eventually going to catch up with us, and that's something that we need to be addressing right now.
I would agree with that. I would also add two other things that I think are essential to promoting competition. Number one is, again, you need to have some government. I don't want to use the word subsidy because that freaks everybody out. I'm not saying that the government should just throw money, not that the government has any money left after saving all the other industries, just throw it at things like tax credits and things like that, the way to, essentially promote investment in broadband. So there needs to be some more government involvement. You see that in places like Japan and South Korea. Sometimes there's straight subsidies, but sometimes there are, other policies to encourage investment. I think the other thing that's really critical is I think we need to do a thorough review of the spectrum resources that we have available in this country and see how they're being used or not. Now, the Michael Oldak, to his credit, started that process a number of years ago, and it was dropped by the Kevin Martin FCC. There's an awful lot of spectrum. That study found, that the Oldak did, that's underutilized, that is just in the hands of government being hoarded. And now the FCC's recent white space decision was really quite a wonderful precedent, because it really said, incumbents, you can't just hog this thing. You're going to let the public use it for unlicensed. I think that's a critical, in addition to the line sharing, infrastructure sharing issues that Ben was talking about, figuring out, what spectrum resources we can make available for unlicensed use or for sharing is really critical.
The Information Technology and Innovation Foundation is actually having a debate at its offices tomorrow about whether or not there is enough competition competition in the broadband marketplace. So if that's a topic of particular interest to you, I encourage you to come by our offices here in DC. My colleagues, George Hoy and Rob Atkinson at ITIF have, as you say, done a lot of research and work into the competitiveness issue with broadband in the United States and access to speeds. One thing they found was that when you look at why the U.S. has slower speeds for broadband access than other countries, about 75% of the differential can be explained to non-policy issues, and 25% towards policy issues. So those non-policy issues relate to the geographic environment where citizens live. So South Korea and Japan have the highest access speeds in the world at levels that are 7 to 13 times faster than the United States. All those countries also benefit from very high population densities, so it's easier to stream high fiber optic cable lines and provide faster speeds to a much higher segment of the population. So we must be mindful that it's not just policy, but it's also non-policy factors to consider the differences in broadband speeds. But yes, the U.S. is behind. This is a problem. I think we would completely agree. One serious problem when you look at the aggregate amount of speeds is that a great number of U.S. citizens who live in rural or less urban communities access the internet through dial-up, and this is a naturally, much slower way to access the internet. So then there is, again, a role for public policy to bring high-speed broadband access to these types of communities. And here, I think, as you say, there's a very strong role for the government to play in providing tax incentives for the broadband providers to add service to these rural areas. One thing we could do is allow for first-year expensing investments from IT companies to bring new broadband access to these communities. We could also make sure that taxes applied to internet access are not charged to consumers. But across the population, moving them up to the next level of internet access from DSL to broadband is a very important public policy challenge to overcoming that hurdle.
On the electricity side, just a quick example, a great example would be the European Union on smart grid or energy internet. They were really looking at this issue closely. And if you think the energy internet not only is the communications component of it, but also having more options for clean energy generation that can then feed in and give options to folks on the type of power they have, and also to lower greenhouse gas emissions. What Europe is doing is they're really trying to provide certainty and clarity. This is where we stand on greenhouse gas. This is where we stand on energy policy. And the thing to keep in mind for the United States is this is an issue also of economic growth and competitiveness. If you look at some of the advances, Europe, frankly, is in the lead on some of these issues. Some of the biggest wind companies, solar companies, as far as policy that they're taking, Germany is an interesting example. They've promoted solar, and frankly, a lot of people wouldn't think of Germany when you thought of solar, but they realize that there's a role to play in trying to encourage the market to develop these technologies. For the United States, again, to tap into this engine of economic growth, we have to look at the broad vision, the policies, and recognize that that's going to give a boost. And one quick point on that is green government. Greening the government, that is something that we can do very quickly if you consider how the federal and state governments can use smart grids, can use plug-in vehicles for some of the fleets, can actively go out and say, we're going to use more of these clean energy options to power our grid. The federal government, in fact, is the largest user of energy, so that type of policy will give a lift to the private sector as well, because they'll have more certainty about that this is needed.
I agree with you. I think we need to, for a lot of what my members do, we rely on regulation. We go to state commissions, and you really need a clear policy that this is the policy, this is the way that we want you to go forward. And when I talk about, I've stolen somebody's line, and we talk about the smart grid, that we were going to deploy it at the speed of value. And let me tell you, I'm sure you've all heard, you can do it all with this technology, or you can do it all with that technology, or it's not any one technology. It's a balance. And with each technology, either it's supply or demand or energy efficiency, whatever, there's a cost. And I think now we are adding to that cost equation the cost of clean air and all these other costs, and it's a balance. And I think we need regulation and policies that understand that balance and make the careful balance with consumer benefits at the bottom end of this, that at the end of that what we are doing, how we are moving forward, where we put our money.